what we are seeing with the situation in Syria in particular is definitely the expansion of the Zionist dream of a greater Israel. And of course, there's also, of course, the issue of the gas pipeline eventually going through Syria and so on. That is clearly the Zionist project is about greater Israel. But we also have to understand the broader geopolitical context of this new Cold War that we find ourselves in. That clearly it's not only about Syria, it's ultimately also about Iran, Russia, and China. So the global context is this new Cold War that we find ourselves in.
The countries that went through the experience of being colonized, stolen, and deprived of their rights know well the importance of helping currently colonized peoples to get rid of the colonial powers and restore their rights. And against this backdrop, we have the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network. Namibia activist of the Pan-African Solidarity Network, Dr. Sean Whitaker, joins me now to highlight the significance of the international public solidarity with Palestine to save the indigenous people of Palestine from the Zionist Israeli genocidal war. Welcome to the program, Dr. Sean.
Thank you so much for having me. It is really an honor to be here today.
You're welcome. Dr. Sean, may you give us a brief about the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network and the activities it's conducting these days? Especially, we have difficult times in Palestine, Israeli genocide against all the Palestinians.
The Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network is a group on the African continent that is in full solidarity with the Palestinian people in their struggle for self-determination. Mm-hmm. We have activists from all over the African continent. We have been in existence for quite a long time. We try to coordinate our activities. For example, as you know, in August this year, the Namibian government refused to give permission to a vessel to come into the Walvis Bay port because the vessel was carrying explosives to Israel. From what we know, the vessel Catherine was coming from Vietnam and carried weapons. And of course, under international law, we have an obligation not to be complicit in this genocide. So that is an example of what our network does. And I am proud to say that we are all over the African continent. We understand what colonialism is about. We understand genocide. So we are in full solidarity with the Palestinian people. Those of us in Namibia, we of course went through a genocide in the early 1900s, perpetrated by German colonialism. Thousands of Namibians were wiped out. And you know, today, more than 100 years later, we still feel the effects of that genocide.
Yes, and here, yes, Dr. Sean, and here I have a question concerning the methods that the German colonial power used against the people in Namibia. They killed, as you mentioned, tens of thousands by starvation and dehydration of the people of Namibia. Today, Israel is using the same method Germany used 100 years ago. Israel is starving Gaza to death. The people are there hungry and dehydrated. So how important such comparison that the colonial comparison of the methods colonial powers used in the past and they are being used today? How important is that? How symbolic is that?
It is very important. It is very important so that the Palestinian people can realize that other peoples have gone through genocide. Obviously, Look, the scale of what is happening in Palestine, in Gaza, is at a much, much broader scale, at a much higher level. But in Namibia, yes, absolutely. The Germans were vicious. They were wiping out people mercilessly. They poisoned the water. They made people walk through the desert, and obviously thousands died in the process. So it is, so it was horrendous. In the same way that what is happening to the Palestinian people is absolutely atrocious. It is completely unacceptable. And the other important thing perhaps to say in terms of the comparison is also to realize that there are other colonial forces complicit as well. In the Namibian case, the English and the Dutch colonizers were complicit in perpetrating the genocide in Namibia. The English killed the most important anti-colonial fighter in Namibia at the time. So there's also this element of complicity from all the colonial forces. And that is why it's so important for all the colonized people to stand together, to support each other, to as far as possible, not only condemn, but also take very concrete action against this kind of genocide. Yes, of course, we've had the case at the International Court of Justice, but we now need more concrete action. We need to expel these Israeli ambassadors. We need to close down these embassies. We need to stop the coal exports to Israel. Certainly in our case, I am very ashamed to say that so many of the diamonds from Namibia go to Israel. The company De Beers, the subsidiary of the Anglo-American Corporation, that many of these blood diamonds come from Namibia. As you know, diamonds are an important export commodity in Israel. They contribute to funding the Israeli army. So we need to take concrete action as well. We need to obviously boycott. In the case of apartheid, the sports boycott was very effective. It was very important also as a way, for the symbolic significance of it. So we need to have an effective sports boycott against Israel. We need to, boycott products from Israel. We need to boycott the Israeli companies. We need concrete action as well. This genocide has been going on for far too long, and we really need to stop it.
Yeah, we see the Palestine Action activists in the UK, for example, from time to time go to the weapons factory of Alpit and trying to close its doors, calling for boycotting the companies that export weapons to Israel. Now, in the African context, Namibia and beyond, what do you do, the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network, to pressure these companies that you're talking about to boycott the Israeli colonial power?
Look, we not so long ago, I am proud to say we now have a BDS Namibia. Mm-hmm. And we have had discussions about what to do in terms of that. An obvious target would be the diamond industry for us in Namibia to target and to look at and to see what kind of mass action we can take. We have in the past had demonstrations in front of the US Embassy in Windhoek, but we obviously need to do more. So absolutely, we need to have a more effective boycott campaign. We need to look at divestment. We need to look at sanctions. In the Namibian case, the obvious target would be the diamond industry.
Yes, and Dr. Shaun, in light of the Israeli power and the Israeli leverage, because of course of the United States and some European countries' support for this colonial power, it was able to penetrate some countries in Africa. So in light of that, how difficult it is for the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network to affect the decision makers in the African continent and convince them that Israel is a colonial power and so must be boycotted?
It is very difficult. There is no doubt about the fact that we are up against very powerful forces. But then again, we said that in the 1980s about the apartheid regime as well, the apartheid regime in Pretoria. And we did manage to bring it down. So if we stay in solidarity, if we keep our organizations going, if we continue with our mass action, we can be effective. We have to be careful not to become demoralized. We must realize that there's so much we can do. We obviously start with creating awareness, but ultimately you need to have further action. We need to look at these African countries that are exporting coal to Israel. We need to look at these African countries that are exporting oil to Israel. Ultimately, Israel is an outpost of Western neocolonialism, and ultimately it's about controlling the flow of oil in the world.
Yes, and Dr. Sean, you said that it is a colonial outpost for the Western colonial powers. And my question here is, we see the shift in the public opinion around the world. The support for the Palestinian people from their peers in the world is overwhelming. But the governments in the West are still stuck to their positions supporting Israel. Now, do you think that the public opinion and the solidarity movements just like yours can overcome the money, capitalistic, imperialistic system? We are talking about, tycoons, governments, economic interest. So is it possible for the public to challenge the governments and their financial interest?
Absolutely. If we engage in mass action, it is possible. If the dock workers refuse to load the ships, if we refuse to give permission to the ships to come into our ports, there is really so much that we can do. If we refuse to buy all these products from Israel, if you go to the local stores in Windhoek, you will find tomatoes, for example, from Israel. So of course, we can make a difference. If we refuse to play sports against Israel, there is really so much we can do. We must never underestimate our power as people engaging in mass action. And I speak from personal experience in bringing down the apartheid regime in Pretoria, that it is totally possible through mass action.
Yeah, and now in light of the very frustrating situation that we have mainly in the Middle East, in the region, as Israel is expanding its position and its, colonial enterprise, decimating Gaza. You see what's happening in Gaza every minute and every day. Grabbing land in the West Bank, occupying more Syrian land. They are just 20 kilometers away from the capital of Damascus. We see what's happening in Lebanon. Don't you think that the Zionist ideology is expanding? Don't you think that the Israeli occupation Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is achieving the goals set by the Zionist movement, and it becomes more difficult for the pro-justice people to challenge that? What do you think?
What we are seeing with the situation in Syria in particular is definitely the expansion of the Zionist dream of a greater Israel. And of course, there's also, the issue of the gas pipeline eventually going through Syria and so on. That is clearly, the Zionist project is about greater Israel. But we also have to understand the broader geopolitical context of this new Cold War that we find ourselves in. That clearly it's not only about Syria, it's ultimately also about Iran, Russia, and China. So the global context is this new Cold War that we find ourselves in. And unfortunately, we are going into a very difficult phase for humanity. But look, we have built up a global movement in solidarity with Palestine. That is a real strength that we must keep and that we must only enhance. With that kind of global movement, we can achieve a lot. We can put pressure on governments. Yes, there are limitations, and clearly the Syrian situation, certainly for the Palestinian movement, is a setback. But we have to understand the broader geopolitical context, but not to become helpless in terms of what we can do at local level. We need to continue with our campaigns and our mobilizations at local level. And that is how we bring about fundamental change.
Yeah, and my final question to you, Dr. Shawn, we used to hear and understand that the colonial powers changed their techniques of colonization. Instead of having their forces on the ground, they use like cultural and economic and the IT methods of colonization. Don't you think that Israel is taking the world back to the ancient era of colonization, militarization, expulsion, and decimation of the indigenous people? And to what extent do you think this Zionist enterprise is going to succeed?
No, I mean, look, it is undoubtedly taking humanity backwards. Zionism is a racist project through and through. There is no place for the Zionist project amongst humanity. And if you look at history, everywhere, a system of oppression will eventually come to an end. Yes, they have their short-term victories, but ultimately the people will prevail, and we must keep our hope alive, keep our organizations together, fight against the Zionist project, fight against racism. We will ultimately succeed, like we did in South Africa and Namibia, by the way.
Dr. Shawn Whitaker, it has been a great honor having you on our program. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All the best.
You're welcome. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. And from you, Osama Nazal, have a nice time.